Good evening and good morning. On behalf of COVID-19 Global Solidarity Coalition, I'd like to welcome you all to our first speaker event, Free Press Equals Free Assange. My name is Rhonda Serhan, and I'm a sociologist currently living between Washington, D.C. and Beirut, Lebanon. As one of the earliest members of CGSC, I would like to share how we came about. As our name suggests, we are a young group having formed as a response to feeling exasperated by COVID and its crushing impact on societies around the world. Our modest aim of creating a network of support among friends and acquaintances around the world quickly turned into a mutual recognition that we all shared a greater desire for a more just and cooperative world. Among us were seasoned anti-war activists, educators, students, those with widely different experiences of strife, organizing, and life. And yet we all shared the same goals, which materialized in our 9-point manifesto, which if you have not had the chance to read yet, I encourage you and invite you to do so. You will find the manifesto translated into 20 languages, covering all of the languages that we speak and beyond. The manifesto was truly a synergy of values, and the writing was such a rewarding and collaborative process that we knew our goals reached far beyond the pandemic moment. Today's panel converges with the 8th demand of our manifesto, which I'll read to you. We demand that governments and corporations respect privacy and not exploit the pandemic to expand repressive measures such as surveillance, detention without trial, and restrictions on basic human rights to assembly, free expression, free determination, and the vote. Before I hand you over to our distinguished moderator and panel, I would like to announce another CGS project that I hope you will join, titled A New Global Compact, coordinated by one of our core members, Harry Carson. His contact information is on the screen right now. The project has been established to develop a left international network for promoting and enhancing left causes. The plan is to bring together online a few internationally based organizations at a time to further develop the process of promoting international relations of cooperation and collaboration. Our discussions will center on our mutual and unique experiences in the realm of the international, as well as our thoughts about what it is going to take to make a true difference in this world. Accordingly, each group will be given the opportunity to contribute its experiences to our collective benefit. We believe that by collectively sharing our struggles, strategies, and methods, that we will be in a good position to build an international network and possibly even a new global social compact. Now it is with my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ron Ridenour, who is a veteran anti-war and civil rights activist, journalist, and author. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. We see that we should have a slide here that explains to us that when the discussion begins, anyone from the audience can either raise their hand to ask a question or make a comment, or you can write something in the Q&A area. If you want to communicate with among yourselves, then you can write something on the chat box. Our 3 speakers today will have about 15 minutes each. And then following their talks, we will have about 10 minutes of interchange where they can speak to each other about what their comments have been. Our first speaker is Joe Lauria, who has led a lifetime of journalism. He took over as editor-in-chief of Consortium News following the death of its creator, Bob Perry. Consortium News Live is also a co-sponsor and is broadcasting this event simultaneously. CN's coverage of the extradition hearings was the most extensive and comprehensive of all media. Joe and his staff, along with contributors, just celebrated 25 years reporting real journalism and revealing fake news fomented by the establishment's political parties and corporate media. Joe, tell us about WikiLeaks, some of its history and some of the aspects of the extradition hearings.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thank you for that introduction about Consortium News. We did indeed celebrate our 25th anniversary. So I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay, to provide what I've been asked to provide, which is a short history of WikiLeaks and a detailed account of what happened during these 4 weeks of hearings in Old Bailey in London. Julian Assange, of course, is integral to the history of WikiLeaks. He was born in Queensland, Australia in 1971, which happened to be the same year that Dan Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. In 1991, he was charged with hacking into a Pentagon computer, and he uncovered evidence of a US attack on civilians in a shelter during the first Gulf War. He was arrested, but as a youthful offender, he was given a minimal punishment. But that has created the stigma of Assange being a hacker, which is very important when we get to the charges against him. In fact, the US has tried to revive this idea that Assange is a hacker, but this happened many, many years ago. He started WikiLeaks in December 2006, a site to obtain and publish sensitive information. Of course, he first collaborated, and this is important, with The Guardian in 2007 on documents about the former President Daniel Arap Moi, his corruption. He also began releasing his first documents on Guantanamo detention camp and did a series on Scientology, who threatened to sue. In 2008, Assange won his first media award from The Economist magazine. Many, many more would come, as many as 30, including the Walkley Award in Australia, which is their equivalent of their Pulitzer. And 2010 is the really key year in the history of WikiLeaks. It was their most consequential year in terms of their releases, and it's also what the indictment focuses on, not anything after that, including the 2016 election. It started in April 5 of that year, 2010, that the Collateral murder video was released. This is probably the best known release of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of documents that WikiLeaks and Assange have released over the years. The Collateral murder video showed from the viewpoint of pilots on Black Hawk helicopter shooting down into a Baghdad street, killing and injuring many civilians. It was clear at a certain point then that these were civilians and not insurgents, and they continued to shoot anyway, even into a van that had come by to try to attend and pick up the wounded and the wounded children that were in the van. It was a hideous video. It also was horrible to hear the American pilots laughing and joking and blaming the people below them. It was a shock, but it was quickly forgotten and did not lead to any kind of charges or investigation into those pilots whatsoever. What it did lead to was the arrest of the source of that video and all these major files of 2010, and that was Chelsea Manning, who was a private with security clearance as an intelligence analyst in Iraq. And she could not bear to keep this secret. She went to the Washington Post and New York Times, who ignored her, and then went to WikiLeaks. Following on that was the Afghan Files and the Iraq war logs, but they came out after May 26th, just 6 weeks after the Collateral murder video. Chelsea Manning was arrested for unauthorized dissemination of these classified documents. Actually, the Collateral murder video was not classified, but certainly many of the Afghan Files in July 2010 and the Iraq war logs of July of that year, of October. October was Iraq, July Afghan. Those were revealed many other crimes and corruption that took place in those two wars. And then in November were the diplomatic cables, also from Chelsea Manning, and that revealed many, many internal documents from the U.S. State Department and their embassies, and we learned of many things around the world. And most consequential probably was that it led, many people believe, to the uprising in Tunisia, what was revealed about the Tunisian government. And that, of course, spread across Arab countries in 2011 and the very, very well-known uprisings. Some people credit WikiLeaks for that. Muammar Gaddafi blamed WikiLeaks. He said, "Don't be fooled by WikiLeaks, which publishes information written by lying ambassadors in order to create chaos." So he was reacting to what happened in Tunisia. The reaction back in the US to all of these releases was fierce. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, was on Meet the Press, and he called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist. Then Senator Joe Biden was asked on Meet the Press whether he agreed with that, and his response was that he was more like Assange, more like a high-tech terrorist than what happened in the Pentagon Papers. The Obama administration impaneled a grand jury, and they wanted very much to prosecute WikiLeaks and Assange for these releases, but they came upon what Eric Holder, the head of the Attorney General under Obama at the time, called their New York Times problem. What's that? Well, the New York Times, along with the Guardian, Der Spiegel, El País in Spain, Le Monde, published many of the same documents that WikiLeaks did, working in conjunction as partners with WikiLeaks. So if they were going to, the Obama administration was going to indict Assange, how could they argue they wouldn't also have to indict the New York Times? So they dropped it. Of course, that changed when the Trump administration came in. But before that, in the same year, December 2010, Assange was arrested in Britain. And that was because of manipulated sex crime allegations. Neither woman ever charged rape. There were never any charges against Assange. These were only allegations. Many people say there were charges, there were not. Assange was given permission to leave Sweden after this initial talk with the police, and he went to the United Kingdom, where he shortly after he arrived, he was hit with a European arrest warrant that was arranged and issued by a prosecutor, not a judge. The law was changed after that because a judge now should be issuing arrest warrants, not a prosecutor. Assange fought the extradition to Sweden in the UK courts, and he got to the Supreme Court and he lost. And that's when he went and received asylum in the Ecuador embassy. The UK would not let Assange leave that embassy for medical treatment. He had various ailments. If they said if he left, he would be arrested. What was he wanted for at that time? Just bail skipping. He was wanted for bail because he went into the embassy rather than face extradition to Sweden. And at the time, he and his lawyer said they didn't believe it was extradition to Sweden. They were fearful that Sweden would extradite him onto the United States. People ridiculed him for that at the time, but of course he's been proven right. It was about a US extradition all along. Within the embassy, he continued to run WikiLeaks. There were many other revelations. The most important one after that was probably the 2016 US election, in which WikiLeaks published leaked DNC, Democratic National Committee, and John Podesta, the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign. They're totally accurate emails. They revealed corruption in the Democratic Party. It led to the resignation of 5 high-ranking members, including the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee. Liberals and liberal media in the US turned against Assange then. They had pretty much liked him because he had revealed Bush administration crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when it came to this election, they turned against him, somehow blaming him for Trump, even though the documents were completely accurate. They were true. I'm talking about the emails. It didn't really matter who the source was, whether it was Russia or not. And Robert Mueller's unredacted pages came out on the eve of just November 2nd, right now, just before this US election, showing that Assange had no idea who he was talking with. So if it were the Russians, Assange didn't know it. Mueller's report said that it was redacted originally. And oddly, on the eve of the US election, the unredacted came out. So we knew that's why he could not charge Assange, although Mueller did want to. He never interviewed Assange, by the way, in the embassy about what happened. The documents are true. As I say, it doesn't matter. And this is borne out by the fact that WikiLeaks is the one that pioneered anonymous drop boxes, which is a source can give documents to WikiLeaks, and they don't even, WikiLeaks doesn't even want to know who the source is. If they can verify the documents are accurate and they're newsworthy, they will publish it. Well, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Guardian, and 60 major news organizations now use anonymous drop boxes, so they don't know who's giving them stuff if it checks out. That's what's important with documents, not who the source is. I mean, Russia could drop something in CNN's box. CNN could run the story and never know who the source was. It's not important when the documents are verified. After Trump was elected, there was a very major release. Vault 7, it revealed CIA cyber tools, things like turning your Samsung TV at home into a spying device, even though you think it's off, and many other things about what the CIA does, although WikiLeaks did not release tools that could be used by others. So they were important to remember that they redacted things. Nonetheless, that infuriated Mike Pompeo, who in his very first speech as a newly appointed CIA director called WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence service, and he called Assange a coward, a fraud, and a narcissist. So revealing crimes and corruption of government and government officials is going to get them very upset, although they couch it in national security. It's very often their own security, their own skins that they're worried about. So a new government then was elected in Ecuador in May of 2017. And after 2 years with Mike Pence going down to Quito and US generals, finally, the Ecuadorian government got something in return for this wonderful prize that they had, Julian Assange, in their embassy that the US desperately wanted. And it was an IMF loan that was arranged and approved. And Ecuador allowed the British police into the embassy, even though he had asylum and he had Ecuadorian citizenship until that point, allowing the British police to drag him out, as we've all seen in April of 2019. He was thrown into Belmarsh prison, where he's been ever since. The indictment was unveiled by the US, 17 charges on the Espionage Act, one on conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. The Espionage Act is the most important. Of course, James Lewis, the prosecutor for the US government, the British lawyer, on the very first day of the resumed hearing in September, addressed the press box and said, "This is not about you." He said, "It's not about publishing, and we're not after the press. This is about Assange revealing the names of informants." And this kind of floored everyone. For the one thing, revealing informants was never, is not in the statute of US law and is not named in the indictment as him having violated this. The indictment is also about Assange passively receiving and possessing documents, unauthorized possession of documents. And the government tried to say it wasn't about that, but many defense witnesses pointed out by literally reading from the government's own indictment. Later in the 4-week process in this hearing, the government, James Lewis, changed this idea by first saying Assange was not a journalist. It's not about journalists. We're not going after the press. We're going after this horrible guy who revealed names of informants. And they eventually said in the hearing that, yes, it was about journalists and he was a journalist and journalists can be charged. And technically they're right about that, because a section of the Espionage Act says any person who has unauthorized possession and who then unauthorized dissemination of that is liable under the Espionage Act to be prosecuted. There is no carve out for journalists, although Ro Khanna and Tulsi Gabbard in the US House of Representatives are trying to write a bill that would amend the Espionage Act, particularly because of the Assange case, that would make an exception for journalists. But as it is now, the government's right. They could get him on this. It is in the view of many people, and I know I'm really interested to know what Marjorie says, that this is unconstitutional as it runs up against the First Amendment. There's a conflict there. And if that bill doesn't get through, one would hope if Assange is extradited to the US, and of course, those of us who understand this case hope that he isn't, that his lawyers would challenge this as an unconstitutional law. So many witnesses were brought on, defense witnesses who explained that Assange was actually engaged in journalistic activity, protecting sources, asking for more information. This is what the indictment says. The indictment actually describes journalistic activity. Bob Parry, who founded Consortium News, in 2010 wrote an article during this whole period back then when those documents were being released, saying that he did the same thing as an investigative reporter known for breaking the biggest Iran-Contra scandals, that he would even encourage his sources to break a small law in order to prevent a larger one. So, and Dan Ellsberg gave great testimony on those aspects of that aspect of the case. The informants again became the major focus of the government, and they wouldn't, and they used as their main source a book by Guardian reporters David Lee and Luke Harding, in which they are quoting Assange saying things like he didn't care if people died, it was their fault for collaborating with the United States, etc. Now, the fact is there was a Der Spiegel journalist present at one of these meetings at a restaurant in London, in which Assange was alleged to have said, "I don't care if they die, they deserve it." The informants, Gertz was on the witness stand, but Vanessa Barreta, the magistrate running this court, would not allow him to testify to that. We were all waiting for him to say that and put it in the record, and he was not allowed to do that. In fact, an Australian journalist, Mark Davis, had said at a meeting in Sydney last year, I believe, that he was there in the bunker with the Guardian and he saw Assange stay up all night the Friday before Sunday publication, redacting the names because he said that the Guardian editors went off to have a weekend, and they didn't care. This is what he says. The New York Times actually first published these diplomatic cables on in a day before WikiLeaks did, but they were trying, but they published in their story that WikiLeaks had published first, because that was the arrangement. WikiLeaks had a technical problem. The Times went first, but their article still says that WikiLeaks published first. Why is that important? Well, if these are classified information, if the government should go after them, who published first? Well, we learned in the court later on that when David Lee and Luke Harding in their book, in the book, I'm forgetting the title, they put the password to the unredacted cables which had the names of the informants. They put out the password. When it became known and it was starting to be published, and Cryptome.org published it first, then Assange had to publish it as well, he said, to try to inform these informants to get to safety. But Cryptome was never charged. John Young, who's the founder and still runs it, put an affidavit into the courtroom saying that he was never questioned by the police at all about this, even though he published it first before. And this is the unredacted cables with the informant's name. Like I said, this is the main thrust of the US case. Now, the big bombshell, we also heard a lot about the health of Julian Assange. Many details we were asked not to report, and we didn't. But essentially, he's on the autistic spectrum. He is suicidal. Many medical experts said if he were extradited to the US, he would very likely commit suicide. And we also heard a lot about the condition of US prisons, that he would be in isolation, most likely in a prison in Colorado. And the conditions were horrific, the way they were described, nothing that could compare in a British prison. And that's important because there has to be dual criminality here, by the way. That's another issue about whether what Assange is being charged for is also a crime in the United Kingdom. So the big bombshell, though, in the testimony was that two anonymous witnesses from a case going on in Spain against David Morales, the CEO of a company called UC Global, they were allowed to testify in the British court, written. Their names were not known. What they said was that Morales, the CEO of UC Global, spied on Julian Assange for US intelligence agency, an unspecified intelligence agency. They spied on his privileged conversations with his attorneys and doctors, and the US even discussed possibly kidnapping or poisoning Assange. This was testimony in the court. They put in cameras with audio. They tried to set up a 24/7 stream so that US intelligence could watch everything that was going on. And the instructions were especially the privileged conversations with his attorneys. So here we have the intelligence arm of prosecuting government spying on the defense preparations, eavesdropping on the defense preparations of the very hearing that then took place in September. In any other case, this would be thrown out immediately. In fact, when I reported this, Dan Ellsberg got very excited, and he tweeted and wrote to me that this is how he got off, and that he expected that this could happen for Julian. This was his best chance. Of course, we all know what happened in Dan's case, that the government tried to bribe the judge with the FBI directorship, and also, of course, broke into a psychiatrist's office and tapped his phones. So Dan said what they did to Assange was even worse than what they did to him. We also got testimony from Cassandra Fairbanks, the journalist, who said that Trump ordered Assange's arrest. That would be useful to the defense to prove it's a political case which violates the US Extradition Treaty. The computer intrusion charge is all based on a Jabber chat, a encrypted chat between someone named Nobody, who we later learned was Chelsea Manning, and someone called Nathaniel Frank. Now, many people assume Nathaniel Frank is Julian Assange. That's never been proven, and it's not proven in this hearing yet. So in order for them to charge Assange, they have to first say that Assange was in conversation with Manning. The indictment says that he tried to help Chelsea break a password so that she could sign in under an administrative password to hide her identity, which again is journalistic practice, normal routine journalistic practice to hide the identity of an anonymous source. It also says, the indictment, that Manning had legal access to all these classified documents. So we heard a expert testimony saying that we couldn't even prove what they were trying to break into, and that it could have been as the fact that Chelsea Manning was also downloading videos, music videos, and video games, because they are forbidden to active service personnel of the military. So she was getting them for her, the soldiers. So this is very cloudy, this whole thing. Now, there was a superseding indictment that was only accepted by Barreto on the day the court began. WikiLeaks lawyers tried to delay the opening of the hearing. She refused. The indictment, superseding indictment, just adds some more details of this computer intrusion charge, mostly from details from 2 FBI informants who ratted on Assange back in when he was in Reykjavik at that time. So these indictment says, the superseding indictment said he spoke at a conference and asked for people to hack things and get stuff, but it doesn't say he hacked anything. It's never really charged with hacking at all in any of these charges. Now I'm closing my submission here by mentioning the closing arguments. On November 16, 5 days ago, the defense was to have given their final submissions, or what we call in the US closing arguments. We have not seen them. It's only in writing. The government in another week will be submitting US government, their final argument, again, written, and we're supposed to see them publicly. We haven't yet. Judgment is coming on January 4th, 2021. Appeals are likely. This is a case of government officials trying to punish a journalist who revealed their crimes and other wrongdoing. And for decades, media has covered up a lot of these crimes that Julian Assange has revealed. And that's one reason the media is against him, and certainly why the government wants him extradited to the United States.
Thank you very much, Joe. You mentioned Pompeii, and I can't avoid reminding our audience, probably everyone has seen this, a great YouTube of this Pompeii speaking last year to AMN University, in which he said, when I was a cadet at West Point, becoming an officer, our motto was, you will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. And then when I became a CI director, I learned that we lie, we cheat, and we steal. Now, of course, he didn't say that we also murder, but he did say that this is like, we take training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment. Now, I think that is just about American exceptionalism, that America is known by its leaders as being a liar, a cheater, and a stealer, a thief. Marjorie Cohn has been an activist lawyer for the underdog, a professor of law, author, and prolific commentator on the side of the people for many alternative and professional media. Marjorie, tell us something pertinent legal issues about this case and how Assange is doing and what you expect will be happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I think it's important for people to understand that the reason that he is being indicted is because WikiLeaks published evidence of war crimes by the Bush administration. And they, in addition to the Collateral murder video, there were the Iraq war logs, the Afghan war logs, and Guantanamo files. In the Collateral murder video that Joe talked about, there was evidence of 3 different crimes under the Geneva Convention, war crimes. First of all, targeting civilians. Secondly, targeting the rescuers of the civilians, because after these 18 people were murdered, these civilians, unarmed civilians, the rescuers were then fired upon by the US soldiers in the Apache helicopter. And then one of the dead bodies was defaced and mutilated when a US Army Jeep drove over it and cut it in half. And that's evidence of 3 separate war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. In addition to the Collateral murder video, we have the Afghan war logs, which showed a greater number of civilian casualties than the US military had copped to. The Iraq war logs, which showed more than 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians and the systematic murder, torture, and rape by the Iraqi army, and the Guantanamo files that documented the abuse and torture of men and boys in violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture. And Joe talked about the redaction issue, and one of the things you see in the indictment against Julian Assange is that he endangered Iraqi and Afghan informants by publishing their names. But John Getz, an investigative reporter from Der Spiegel, testified at the extradition hearing that Assange took great pains to redact out the names of US informants. He said that Julian Assange went through a very rigorous redaction process, repeatedly reminding his media partners to use encryption, and that Assange actually tried to stop Der Freitag from publishing material that could result in the release of unredacted information. Moreover, and this is something we don't hear much about, WikiLeaks revelations actually saved lives. After WikiLeaks published evidence of Iraqi torture centers the US had established, the Iraqi government refused Obama's request to extend immunity to US soldiers who commit criminal and civil offenses, and as a result, Obama had to withdraw US troops from Iraq. Now, one of the things that Joe mentioned was that Julian Assange is accused of being a hacker, and the US government is trying to stress that because they have had so much criticism for punishing him and indicting him for practicing journalism. And so they're accusing him of conspiring with Chelsea Manning, who turned over these leaked documents to WikiLeaks, conspiring with her to break in to a government computer to steal government documents in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But a digital forensic expert testified at Assange's extradition hearing that the attempted cracking of the password hash was not technologically possible in 2010 when the conversation between Assange and Manning occurred. And even if it were feasible, the purpose would not have been to conceal Manning's identity, and it would not have given Manning any increased access to government databases. Now, under the extradition hearing between the United Kingdom and the United States, which is the basis for this hearing, this 4-week hearing in the UK in London, the Trump administration trying to get Julian Assange extradited to the US for trial, and he's facing 175 years in prison. The UK-US extradition treaty specifically forbids the extradition of a person for a political offense. The treaty doesn't define political offense, but it generally includes espionage, treason, sedition, and crimes against state power. Trump is asking the UK to extradite Assange for exposing war crimes. That's a classic political offense, and he's charged under the Espionage Act, and espionage constitutes a political offense as well. No media outlet or journalist has ever been prosecuted under the Espionage Act for publishing truthful information because that's protected by the First Amendment. Journalists are allowed to publish material that was illegally obtained by a third person if it's a matter of public concern. And the US government has never prosecuted a journalist or a newspaper for publishing classified information, which is an essential tool of journalism. And as Joe said, Obama, who actually indicted and went after a record number of journalists, refrained from indicting Julian Assange. They considered it and refrained from doing it because then they would have to go after the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, etc. But Trump, who is furious at anything Obama did and is out to cut that off, was very, very upset when Obama commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence as he was leaving office. She was sentenced to 35 years after serving 7 years. Obama commuted the rest of her sentence, and that infuriated Donald Trump. Now, there's another reason that Julian Assange should not be extradited under the law, extradited to the United States, and that is the Convention Against Torture, which is a treaty the US and the UK have ratified. That makes it part of the US law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. And the Convention Against Torture has a provision called non-refoulement. and that forbids extradition to a country where there is substantial grounds to believe the person would be endangered of being tortured. Now, when Chelsea Manning was in custody in the US, she was held in solitary confinement for 11 months. That constitutes torture. And Julian Assange's health has severely deteriorated because of the UK government's refusal to allow him medical attention while he was under a grant of asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And Niles Melcer, a UN special rapporteur on torture, examined Assange, and in May of 2019, confirmed that Assange exhibited signs of prolonged exposure to psychological torture. And as Joe said, he is also a risk for suicide. If he were sent to the United States, if he's extradited to the United States, and by the way, after Baretzer makes her decision on January 4th, and she has granted extradition in 96% of the cases that have come before her, and she even tipped her hand saying there was a high likelihood that he would be extradited, then there will be several levels of appeal in the UK courts and eventually an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. But if he is sent to the United States, if he is extradited to the United States, and that won't be probably for a couple of years if it does happen, he would be held in a supermax prison, and there was testimony in the extradition hearing about this, in solitary confinement, under special administrative measures, denied meaningful contact with his lawyers, and given the torture that he has experienced, his severe health issues, which make him at particularly high risk for the coronavirus, and the fact that he's a suicide risk, would be devastating. And it would be very difficult for him to get a fair trial in the United States, because the US press is likely to jump on board and talk about these discredited allegations. They weren't even allegations. They were there was talk in Sweden investigating him for sexual assault. Later, the complainers were recanted, and they dropped the investigation. But also, the case is filed in the Fourth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals in Virginia, which is where the so-called War on Terror cases were filed. It's a very right-wing court. The media has vilified him. He'd be put in solitary confinement. He'd be denied meaningful contact with his attorneys. And so it would be very, very difficult for Julian Assange to get a fair trial. But the bottom line is that he is being prosecuted for revealing war crimes. And we have to keep that firmly in mind, regardless of what WikiLeaks did or didn't do before or after. That's what the indictment is all about. It's about revealing war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, at Guantanamo Bay, and the CIA black sites. And this, if Julian Assange is extradited and indicted, and he is indicted and tried and convicted and sentenced, this will send a message to journalists all over the world. You publish material critical of the US government at your own peril. It will chill the First Amendment freedom of the press, and it will be a blow straight to the heart of journalism and of media and the public's right to know. It's an extremely important case, and the fact that the corporate media in this country has engaged in a virtual blackout of news. You have to get it from the alternative media, from places like Consortium News, from sites that I write on, from other places like this webinar, is an outrage. And so we really have to do everything we can to free Julian Assange and prevent him from being locked up for 175 years for practicing journalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. It's just dreadful. In introducing our next speaker, it gives us an occasion to salute whistleblowers around the world. Since Daniel Ellsberg came out with the Pentagon Papers almost a half a century ago, we've seen hundreds of whistleblowers, insiders, come over to the people. And I want to just mention 3 or 4 names out of these hundreds. I think it's already, you know, Chelsea Manning has already been mentioned. I just think that it's very important for us to honor her for her tenacity, her bravery, and standing so solidly with the principle of not revealing anything that she may or may not know about Julian Assange. She has just done a fantastic service to humanity. I think we need also to recognize William Binet and Edward Snowden, who've revealed so much about the omnipresent global surveillance by the United States' so-called National Security Agency. And they, of course, especially Edward Snowden, was very much assisted by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange personally. There's also Catherine Gunn, a British woman who revealed many of the US and UK war crimes against Iraq. Mordechai Vanunu, very difficult for me to pronounce, but this is an Israeli who spent 20 years in prison because he revealed Israel's secret nuclear bombs, which are there illegally. Of course, all nuclear bombs should be illegal, but and there are so many more wonderful humans who have come out against our oppressors. I thank you one and all. Daniel has not only been a whistleblower and a sterling author, his last book, Doomsday Machine, is a must read, but he's also been an anti-war activist, and I think he still is. And this is how we met in Los Angeles during the Vietnam War resistance. Daniel, give us some of your words.
If Julian Assange is successfully extradited to the United States on these charges, no journalist in the world who presents information that has been stamped classified by the United States, that has been given to her or him by any means whatever, will be free of the danger of being extradited to the United States and is effectively kidnapped from any country that has an extradition treaty with the US. And in the US itself, the very prosecution of Julian Assange would be unprecedented as a journalist, a publisher. That has always been regarded as a violation, any such proposed prosecution, and there have been considerations of such prosecutions before, and they've always been rejected by the Department of Justice on the grounds that it would be a blatant violation of the First Amendment, the freedom of the press in our country. They were considered, the New York Times reporters to whom I gave the Pentagon Papers back in 1971 were in fact subject to a grand jury at that time, which was dropped mainly, I think, because of the fact that they were subject to the same kind of illegal surveillance that was exposed in my trial and which led to the dropping of charges on me. Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith were actually under investigation then, as was Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, two academics to whom I'd given parts of the Pentagon Papers. And again, when they asked whether they had been subject to warrantless wiretaps, to illegal wiretapping, they weren't further called to the grand jury, but they might well have been indicted anyway if had the charges not been dropped because of the revelation by whistleblowers, in effect, some within the government and out, of the illegal surveillance in my case. Now, I do think the press at that time and ever since, and we're talking that was 49 years ago, have always, in my opinion, neglected to face up to the legal and constitutional aspects of these prosecutions, mine and all of the ones since, in two ways. They've never really addressed the fact that charges under the Espionage Act do not allow the defendant to justify his actions in terms of motives, impact, potential impact, the benefit to the country that is hoped for by the leaker, let's say, and what actual impact has had, whether it had any harm, actual harm or not. I was not allowed to answer the question, why did you copy the Pentagon papers? It was held to be irrelevant by the prosecutor, upheld by the judge, and that has been true in every one of the cases since then of people who were sources like me or like Chelsea Manning, Tom Drake, and others who had been officials and who realized that they had been wrong or would be wrong in continuing to withhold from the public information that had been wrongfully withheld from them, and where the secrecy and the lies that maintained it had led to the death of very many people, or as in the case of Snowden's revelations, amounted to a abrogation of the Fourth Amendment and other aspects of the Bill of Rights and of our constitutional system in general. The wording of the Espionage Act, as I say, on the one hand, doesn't allow for discussion of motives, as in most cases. It's what's called a strict liability offense, in which motivation is not an element of the offense or defense either. And that means that it's impossible for a whistleblower who is trying to serve the interests of the United States, of his countrymen, and or uphold the Constitution, or to reveal lies or crimes, cannot be discussed at all, which means the possibility of a fair trial is precluded. None of these people have had fair trials or could have a fair trial, and that's true as well of Julian Assange. But it's also the case that even the Obama administration, which had prosecuted 9 such cases of whistleblowers or leakers, classified information, which was 3 times the small number that had been prosecuted before. Only 3 had been prosecuted, starting with me. And the reason that was so low was that it was understood on the whole by lawyers in the Justice Department that it was against the First Amendment, even to prosecute under the Espionage Act sources like me, who had signed a non-disclosure agreement, which we were violating because it needed to be violated at that point in the interest of the Constitution. As officials, we had all taken oaths to protect, to defend and support the Constitution of the United States. And the crimes and unconstitutional actions that were being protected by classification were clearly violations of that oath if we continued to be silent about them. But it was clear that the language of the Espionage Act, which had not been written to cover whistleblowers or people who disclosed information to the American public, it was meant for spies. But nevertheless, the drafting of that act and its amendments, as later enacted, was so broad that it obviously could cover not only journalists and publishers, but even readers of what they published. Anyone who had unauthorized access to that information, which the New York Times might have labeled classified, which they often did. That's why we're not telling the source that they would say, because this information is classified. Knowing that a person reading it and giving it to their spouse or their children or anybody else would be distributing that information rather than, and holding it, maintaining it, rather than giving it to the proper authorities, whatever that might mean in the case of a newspaper. Well, the journalists took the attitude they'll never apply that to readers, and that hasn't yet been done. But the language is there. What's more serious, though, is that that language very clearly referred, or it could cover, the journalists. Now, clearly, the First Amendment, freedom of the press, was meant to allow journalists to inform the public of what was newsworthy, what they needed to know to fulfill their obligations as citizens, actually, and to hold the government accountable and to choose among their representatives. But the journalist said, well, it's never happened to us. And it only applies to these sources. And I can say as a source, not only in that occasion, but on others, sources can't expect much respect from the journalists they deal with. They may expect something different, but they will be disappointed. Julian Assange, well, Chelsea Manning, Snowden, Julian Assange, I think all experienced great contempt from the other journalists that they dealt with. Only one of those was a journalist, Julian, but they all got profiles, as I did actually, from the New York Times, that were extremely, not just condescending, but falsely, virtually slanderous. And that's a little surprising. People don't know that. I can say that from experience. But it's very good for a journalist actually to be in the position of being interviewed or being a source or something and have the experience of being misquoted. It's very healthy for them in a way to discover how that works. But the journalist aspect, as Julian is facing, directly cuts at the notion of a free press, and actually a free press is the heart of a republic. As I've said on some occasions, unauthorized disclosures other than handouts, information that the government has not chosen to put out freely about what they've done that might condemn their actions as criminal or deceptive, unconstitutional. Unauthorized disclosure is the life's blood of a republic. Without it, with only government handouts, essentially, which is what every administration really secretly wants, but they haven't all taken as blatant efforts to suppress that, as the Obama administration did, followed now by the Trump administration, which has indicted even more people than the 8 years of the Obama administration. But see, now the new one, not only the source, but the journalists themselves. And their holding of this information, they're acquiring it, as well as they're publishing it, would put us in the hands of a state that can't really be called democratic, certainly with respect to foreign policy or what's called national security in a very broad sense, much of which actually impairs our true national security. But anyway, military matters, the military budget, and the threats that are posed by the very possession of some of our weapons. So there's a great deal at stake here. And as I say, the press as a whole has failed to inform themselves on the constitutional issues here. I know that because I've read the articles on this by legal scholars, naturally, because of my own concern in this case and my continuing concern about the need for whistleblowing. And I found that journalists almost entirely are ignorant of these issues, and they've remained so even now when at last a case is being held against, I would like to say, one of their own, one of them, but very not coincidentally, the case, of course, is being brought against someone that they can choose to recognize as not being one of them, as being something other, something that hasn't yet reached them or confronted them with a real challenge. So they want to say that Julian Assange is not really a journalist. These are absurd positions, basically, and is a very unpopular figure in many ways. And for a reason, by the way, that I'll just mention briefly, not for what he did in 2010 or 2013 when he helped Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong, actually with the help of his assistant, Sarah Harrison, who accompanied him to Moscow. But 2015 and 16, when he is perceived very widely and with some reason as having disserved the election campaign of Hillary Clinton. And that made him very unpopular among my friends, shall I say, liberals, people who did not vote for Donald Trump. The fact is, 63 million people did vote for Donald Trump. And Julian was not unpopular with them. However, actually, that doesn't bode well for the treatment he can expect from the administration of Joe Biden, who was vice president at that time. Hillary Clinton has been mentioned even as a possible official in the Biden administration. There's no question that she at that time, and as has been quoted by Joe Lauria, Biden as well, were extremely hostile. So on the one hand, we have the fact that the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration, did choose not to prosecute Julian, and that was absolutely right in constitutional terms, that they could not prosecute him without prosecuting the New York Times as well. They didn't want to do that, and either one would be blatantly unconstitutional. So that would seem to be very promising then. That administration can be appealed to, and you say, you had it right that time. Now you're the president rather than the vice president. Your Department of Justice should reach the same conclusion. But there's one thing that stands in the way. They reached those judgments back in 2013 and around then, even 2015. 2016 gave them a very different feeling about Julian Assange. And the way these things go back and forth, Trump, the one who eventually indicted Julian, was saying in 2016, I love WikiLeaks. But, once you get in office, the perspective changes. And when I think now that we have a president-elect, actually, I can't count at all that they will not choose to press this case against the decision of the prior Obama administration because of their feelings about 2016. Now, as Joe Lauria brought out in his very comprehensive discussion of the case, it has been revealed now that in the evidentiary hearing about extradition, there was sensational revelations. I would say sensational, except ignored by the press, amazingly enough, except by a brief AP story that I am aware of, that Julian had been subject to crimes by an American intelligence agency, almost surely the CIA, conceivably NSA, but probably a national security agency, but probably the CIA, that he had been overheard even more extensively than I was on unwarranted wiretaps. In his case, he was surveilled every moment of the day and night, including in the women's bathroom lavatory in the Ecuadorian embassy, to which he had gone with his lawyers to speak in suspicion that he might be under surveillance otherwise, and not being apparently sufficiently suspicious of the reality, which was that there were wiretaps, there were microphones in the under the fire extinguisher and elsewhere in the plugs in the women's bathroom. Every inch of the place was surveilled, so that everything that his doctors found in discussion, but everything that he said with his lawyers, including their documents, which were surveilled, was in the hands of American intelligence as arranged by them at their request, actually. Now, in my case, when it came out that I had been overheard on warrantless wiretaps and that no record of this, which had been testified to, could be found in the FBI files because it was so clearly criminal that it had been moved to the White House, the evidence for this, to get it out of the FBI files. And that there had been efforts to incapacitate me, Daniel Ellsberg, totally. Those were the words, incapacitate Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol at one point. Attempted assault or murder, in other words. These were among the things that came out. Amazingly enough, the very same discussion was taking place, is testified to by the people who've been working for this global center, surveillance center that was based in Spain, actually, but had the security contract with the Ecuadorian embassy. And they had discussed poisoning Julian Assange. Actually, in other words, the same things that were revealed in my case, and the revelation of which led to the dismissal of charges against me, with the judge saying that the totality of the circumstances, the bizarre circumstances, as he put it, offends a sense of justice and made it impossible to try me fairly. And my co-defendant, Tony Russo, and charges were dropped. And much more importantly, these actions, once revealed, figured in a major way in the impeachment hearings of Richard Nixon, which led to his resignation, and in that case, made the war endable at that point, the war, the Vietnam War. Now, these crimes, almost certainly approved at the highest levels, would be certainly worthy of being regarded as high crimes and misdemeanors, as in the Nixon case, worthy of impeachment of a president who has now, though he's refusing to admit it, has just been deposed by an election. But had he not, had he in fact won, as he's claiming, these would have been appropriate charges to bring against him. The immediate point is, though, it would be ridiculous to extradite to the United States an Australian citizen and Ecuadorian citizen under the US Espionage Act, who not only could not be tried fairly in the US, even if these acts had not occurred, but against whom these crimes had been committed. And specifically, not only with discussions of killing him, but with total discussion of his knowledge, of his discussions with his lawyers. It's absurd for him still to be in prison, and as we've just learned in the last few days, locked down in a prison that has had in his own cell block several COVID cases. And so for his own security, everybody is being locked down in there. He's been in effect in isolation now for more than a year, and that's in very bad health. So the whole thing is a travesty from start to finish, both in the charges against him and in the unfairness, the injustice of it, and the danger, the physical danger that he's in really now has been discussed by the other people. But I would say in the larger context, even more seriously, this is a danger not just to Julian Assange or an injustice to Julian Assange. It amounts to the withdrawal of our basic freedom that of a democratic republic and its ability to get the information that has been wrongfully withheld by the government. And it's something that the press should be regarding as a direct attack on their foundational purpose for being, on their functions, and being concerned by Congress as to their ability to get information as an independent branch of government. This, needless to say, is not happening. It is a great failure of our media so far. People like Consortium News, Joe Lauria, Kevin Gosztola, Shadow Proof, I think it's called, did very good reporting on this. And Craig Marie, former ambassador, wrote things, but it was to them. Somebody else pointed that the Worldwide Socialist Web, I've seen one or two of their pieces, was covering this pretty well. These are not what we call mainstream media. And I think most people in the United States remain entirely ignorant that this is happening, what the facts are, or what the issues are, what the risks are for American democracy, what the constitutional issue, and unfortunately to this day, that's true of most of the press. So there's still time for that to be remedied. It needs very much to be remedied, and I'm very appreciative of programs like this or events like this that enable us to alert others to the problem.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, as activists often say in Latin American countries, somos todos Assange. And the media, the mass media, should recall this and say to themselves, We are all Julian Assange. Thank you very much, speakers. And we now have about 10 minutes. We have 17 questions. I'm picking some, and we'll after our 10-minute interchange here, start to call on them, or I'll read them up to specific speakers. Do the three of you have anything you'd like to say, given what others have said, or something that you forgot to say? Let's take about 10 minutes with that, and then we'll have a half an hour discussion.
I would just briefly say that I left out an important part of the hearing, which was Jen Robinson, one of Assange's lawyers.
Yeah.
Her testimony was read, in which she talked about a meeting with Dana Rohrabacher, who was a U.S. congressman at the time, who she said was sent by Trump to the Ecuadorian embassy to offer a deal of pardon if he revealed who the source was of the DNC emails. And Assange refused, sticking with the principle of not giving up his sources. However, this was important from the defense's point of view because it showed the political nature again of this. And some theorize that Trump was furious that Assange wouldn't try to clear him from the Russiagate burden that he was under. And that's one reason he wanted him indicted and arrested. And in fact, as I said, Cassandra Fairbanks testified that Trump ordered this arrest. This point of view, I wanted to thank because it showed the political nature again of this. And some theorize that what's going on? Trump was furious that Assange wouldn't try to clear him from the Russiagate burden that he was under. And sorry about that. Our live stream started. I just wanted to thank Marjorie for what and Dan for what they said about our coverage. We were one of the few media outlets who were able to get access to the courtroom remotely. We saw every minute on the screen. And there was one other thing about the title of the book I missed, which was Inside WikiLeaks, the Guardian's book. That's all I wanted to add. Oh, and one other thing about the fact, how can an Australian journalist working outside the United States be indicted by the Espionage Act because of a 1961 amendment to the Espionage Act that allowed universal jurisdiction? Before 61, Assange could not have been charged under this. And that came out of a case of an American diplomat in the embassy in Warsaw who was caught in bed with another woman, and the Polish security services got a photograph. They blackmailed him to get classified documents. He took him out of the embassy and no longer on US territory, went up to Polish territory. Some congressman got crazy about that and had this amendment put in. That's how Assange could be charged.
Well, thank you, Joe. You've actually answered a couple of questions that have been asked. Does anyone else, Marjorie or Daniel, have something you'd like to add or exchange that others have said?
I see one question here. Questions, has the Espionage Act been challenged in the Supreme Court? Good question. The answer is no. The one person who brought this up to the Supreme Court, Morrison, who was the second person after me to be charged with this about 10 years after my case, brought it up to the Supreme Court, but they denied hearing it certiorari. So it has never been addressed in the Supreme Court to this day, actually, with the constitutional issues of this. If we go back 49 years, the chances, the legal basis of it, the chances for my conviction being overturned, that is the Espionage Act being overturned on constitutional grounds, were quite good at that point. That can't be said today. There's been enough changes we've seen in the Supreme Court even before Trump. So we can't at all be confident that the current five majority justices will notice that there are extreme constitutional violations going on here. But in any case, they haven't ever yet addressed it.
Right. We're going to get into the questions in just a couple of minutes. Is there anything else that you three would like to say regarding something that Marjorie? Yes.
Yeah. In 1919, there was a prosecution that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Schenck v. US. Schenck was a socialist. He was an official in the National Socialist Party. He was an anti-war activist. And he was charged under the Espionage Act and convicted, and the Supreme Court upheld his conviction against a First Amendment challenge, saying that by distributing flyers and circulars against the draft, he created a clear and present danger to the United States. And therefore, the First Amendment didn't stop his prosecution under the Espionage Act. And about the same time, another socialist, Eugene Debs, was tried and convicted under the Espionage Act. His conviction went all the way to the Supreme Court. He gave an anti-war speech, and his conviction was also affirmed by the Supreme Court.
Wow. Okay. If you don't have any more to say to each other, let's open up to the questions. I think I'll take the opportunity to select some. We have 22 questions, and Ann Batista, maybe I'm not pronouncing your last name very well, but she's asked several questions. I'll pick a couple, and I think one should go to Joe. She's asked about Vault 7, and she says something about you perhaps did not say that Assange, or rather the Democratic National Committee's emails were leaked rather than hacked.
She's talking about the DN, not Vault 7, but the DNC and Podesta emails.
Yeah, she also mentioned Vault 7. I don't know if you could take both those questions.
Okay, well, I'm not sure what you're talking about. The DNC emails and the Podesta emails. Well, the DNC hired a company called CrowdStrike to examine their servers, and they came up with statements that Russia had hacked them. But in closed-door testimony that only became revealed this year with Sean Henry, who was the president of CrowdStrike, he said they had no evidence that there was exfiltration from the servers. So there was no proof of any hack, let alone by Russia. That's what the head of CrowdStrike said. So, of course, there are those like the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, who publish at Consortium News, who have argued even earlier that this was an internal leak, that it couldn't have been transferred overseas because of the speed rates, etc. My point before was it didn't matter to me who got the emails because they were true. So it could be Russia, it could be somebody else. So I'm not saying it was Russia. I'm not saying it was anybody else. I don't know. I'm saying it's irrelevant from the point of view of journalism, who the source was, if the documents are verified and accurate. We're not talking about oral statements in an interview with a source. We're talking about documents. So that's what the position is. Again, I don't think it's relevant, but Sean Henry said that there was no exfiltration, that they had evidence, even though they'd made statements all along and wound up in Mueller's indictments that the 12 GRU agents were responsible for that. Yeah. Now about Vault 7, I'm not sure what the question is.
I can mention Vault 7 if you want me to.
Well, yeah. Could I make a point here, please, Marjorie, even to break in? I think we should all recognize these issues have nothing to do with the case brought against Julian, literally nothing to do. We're talking about a hypothetical prosecution which has not been brought about events that took place after 2010. They have no bearing on the charges or the issues, the constitutional issues at all. So we could just as well argue, we could talk about Breitbart, we could talk about any journalist you want in some other case, but whatever Julian did after 2010, I don't know if any of these charges go to 2011, but has really no bearing on this case. Am I wrong?
I think that's correct. That's correct.
Okay. A technical question that 3 people have asked already. Satoko, can you say whether or not this can be seen, that this can be seen after today? And it's being, somebody has asked, it is being shown live now on Consortium News.
That's right. We picked up the live stream. Yeah. There was a problem with us on our end for some reason.
Can this be seen after we're through today somehow?
Yes. In an hour, the entire program will be available to people who want to see it on Consortium News. Thanks for the question.
Great. All right, great. Yukari has asked, and I think this could be for anyone, given as it has just been mentioned, Daniel, thank you for saying that this COVID has now come to the cell block where Assange is. someone has asked Yukari, can't there be some emergency measure taken available to the public or lawyers that to stop this horrendous treatment of him now? Isn't this an extra motivation that can be used somehow? Can Marjorie or anyone?
Well,
Yeah, Marjorie.
Julian Assange's defense team has argued to Judge Barrister in the London court that he is at particular risk for the coronavirus because of his pulmonary weaknesses and pre-existing condition as a result of the lack of medical treatment, the medical treatment that was denied him when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy by the UK government. And there had been, I believe, even then, even a few months ago, cases of the coronavirus in Belmarsh prison, which is where Julian Assange is being held. And yet she denied that request by his lawyers. So he is in danger, he is in jeopardy of contracting the coronavirus. And if he does, it would be devastating to him.
And her ruling cannot be challenged at this point by a higher court?
I think they could have taken a writ to a higher court. I don't know if they did on that particular issue. We have the same situation in the United States where prisons are basically incubators for the COVID-19. And those challenges don't go anywhere. You know, people who are incarcerated have many fewer rights than people on the outside.
One more question to you, Marjorie. And the fact that there has been disallowed normal oral closing remarks, and apparently, I don't know, but it sounds like the public will never know what the closing remarks are. Is this really legal? I mean, how can she get away with this?
Well, I don't know what her justification was. She might be talking about national security, and I think that would be absurd. There's no national security risk with releasing the closing submissions. There have been extensive, I think, 200 or 300 pages of closing submissions by the defense, and the prosecution and I think that was November 10th, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think the prosecution has 2 weeks. That would be the 24th, if I'm not mistaken about these dates. To
November 16th, yeah.
Right, okay, so it was the 16th plus 14 is what?
Right.
I'm not a great mathematician. At any rate, the prosecution will give its closing submissions. They are, they're extensive, they're in writing, but for some reason, they're not being released to the public.
Well, I mean, how can we be sure that she's going to read 200 pages?
You can never be sure that any judge is going to read anything.
Right, okay. Dennis asks, what is the government's legal rationale for indicting a non-U.S. citizen under this Espionage Act who allegedly committed crimes outside of the U.S. territory? I mean, he's never lived in the United States. I mean, how can this happen?
I think I answered that before by talking about that 1961 amendment. They have
Yes, I'm sorry.
They have universal jurisdiction. They can pick up any journalist anywhere in the world if they feel, the U.S. government, that they broke U.S. law.
Right.
Which technically he did, if you look at that section of the Espionage Act, which is unconstitutional, most reasonable people would say. But they have a universal jurisdiction in the Espionage Act.
Right. Trump has, it's been said that Trump intervened here through another politician. And the question goes out, does this mean that the president could individually drop the charges? And if that's the case, could Biden drop the charges? And if that's the case, can we not put pressure? Can there not be put pressure by the public to do this?
This really goes to the whole issue of the independence of the Department of Justice, which is run by the Attorney General. And it is the Attorney General is not the president's personal lawyer. The Attorney General is the Attorney General of the United States. And but Trump has made it very clear that he considers the Attorney General to be his personal lawyer. And he fired Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the Mueller investigation, and now has his lackey in place. But Biden has made it very clear, Joe Biden has made it very clear that he wants the Department of Justice to be independent. In fact, he has said, when asked about whether or not he would pursue or stand in the way of the indictment of Donald Trump for the many crimes that he has clearly committed, he said that he is going to remain, he wants to look forward, not backward, which is exactly what Barack Obama said about prosecuting the torturers from the Bush administration. Was a big mistake. But Biden has said many times that he wants the Attorney General and the Department of Justice to be independent. That said, Barack Obama certainly had close communication with Eric Holder, his Attorney General, and so I think that Biden, if there is pressure put on Biden, and he's not going to do things without pressure, that's what I'm writing about as we speak, then perhaps he could be persuaded, and Barack Obama's example, following Barack Obama's example of not indicting Julian Assange because of the New York Times problem.
That's an interesting point, Marjorie. This came out in the hearing, the politicization of the Department of Justice. That became a point for the defense to try to show this is a political case. And we heard that Barr, the Attorney General, actually believes in this cockamamie unitary executive idea, and he believes, and he said in speeches this year, Barr, that the president should be the one to determine who's indicted or not, as if he were a king. So Barr is a big part of the problem too, not just Trump, as you pointed out. But that came out in the hearing. That's an interesting point you made, Marjorie, that Biden, if you wanted to go back to the rationale that the Obama administration had for not indicting, could use this, and that would be great. And Trump also could pardon Assange. Some people saying that he might pardon Assange and Snowden just out of thumbing his nose at the establishment, but I'm not holding my breath.
No. Joe, someone has asked that you said that Julian would be handed regarding the request by Sweden the second time to ask Assange to come to Sweden to be asked once again about this sexual claim. How did this come out that that this would be the case, that if he would be handed over to the CIA, rather to the US, if he did come to Sweden? How did this come to light?
No, well, this is what his lawyers, and he said at the time that he went into the embassy, that he could not afford to go back to Sweden because he felt he would be unwittingly extradited to the United States. And we now know that that's what the US wanted to happen. So that's what that was about. There was another point was the Stefania Morizzi, the Italian journalist, in her great work in getting FOIAs, was able to show the British Crown Prosecution Service put enormous pressure on the Swedish government not to interview Assange via video, which Sweden had apparently done in other cases with someone they needed to interview abroad. So the British government all along did not want Assange to go to Sweden, and they wanted him to leave the embassy and go to Sweden. And once he stepped out of the embassy, they could have arrested him for his bail skipping, and then they could have started. Then the U.S. could have unveiled the indictment if it was ready, and the Obama administration, it would not have happened. But the Swedish issue was dropped 4 times. We have to keep in mind 4 different times, I believe. 3 times. Okay, 3 times. That's enough. That case was dropped, and right. He didn't fear that case so much as being sent to the United States if he'd gone back to Sweden. Okay.
Regarding the Espionage Act, Marjorie, do you know if there's any treaties? I mean, the fact that the Espionage Act allows journalists to be picked up anywhere in the world. Are there any treaties, international treaties or treaties with the United States that prohibit such a thing?
Well, as I said, the extradition, if he is extradited to the United States, the extradition treaty between the United Kingdom and the United States is going to be determinative, and that extradition treaty prohibits the extradition of someone for a political offense. And exposing war crimes, which is what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange did in 2010, 2011, is a classic political offense. So just under that extradition treaty, that would prevent his extradition. And one of the grounds for extradition is espionage. He's not charged with espionage, but he's charged under the Espionage Act. So that's another ground to show that he is being, that the extradition is being requested for a political offense, and a reason that the judge should deny extradition. And if she doesn't, if she grants extradition, then as I said, there would be several levels of appeal, and eventually it would get to the European Court of Human Rights, and they would assess the legalities under this extradition treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom.
Okay. Satoko, you're saying that someone's raising their hand. I can't see that. If you can.
Well, there are 3 hands up right now from Gary Brumbach, David Vine, and Baptista.
Okay, let's hear from David. Just speak, David. I can't see your question, so. Can you let him speak, Satoko?
Yes.
Good.
Actually, that must have been an error. My hand wasn't up.
Oh, okay. Well,
Uh,
Gary has his hand up for a while.
okay, Harry.
I asked him to unmute. Yeah.
Did you say Harry?
Well, I invited Gary to speak.
Oh, Gary. Okay.
Are you there, Gary?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can the panelists hear me?
Yes.
Well, the point I want to make, and I think maybe Daniel might have alluded to it, is that we are all Julian Assange. The only people in America who are free of this, who have what I call a high liberty quotient, are about 15,000, mostly men, who are members of the power elite of our hypocrisy. And they are ruling and ruining our nation and the world. They are killing the future. And if we don't stop them, they will kill the future. Now, I've got many ideas as to how to stop them. One is that the power elite in corporate America and government America depend on props from each other to support and expand their power. And one example is stay out of jail cards that government gives corporate America. Corporate America gives government campaign funds, financing funds. So they depend on each other. And I've identified about 25 of these props, and I've set up a U.S. Democracy Corps that if I could get it established and get about 15 million people and get it organized, we could knock down all of those props and we would no longer have the power elite. And this could be done peacefully and legally. And we could lead from there to a new People's America where power is more evenly distributed among the whole populace. And there would no longer be homelessness, no longer be tremendous income inequality gap, etc. That's the point I want to make. And I would encourage people to look at my book, The Achilles Heel of Public Enemy #1. And public enemy #1 are those power elite. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments to that? I think that's a good comment in of itself. We're running out of time now. I think it's a good idea to begin to close down, and I think we should see the slides, Satoko, of how to support Julian Assange. These are some ideas that we have. I would think that we could write letters to editors of support. We could ask the media to cover the hearings. For example, in Denmark, where I live, I've written to several media. None of the media in Denmark has even covered any of the extradition hearing. I'm sure that this is the case in many countries. And it's not just a problem with the UK and the United States. It's actually a worldwide problem. And there's 5 governments directly involved in this, Sweden and Ecuador and Australia, in addition to the UK and the United States. I think that we also put as much pressure on the new government as possible. They're not going to do anything for the people other than just get rid of Trump, and then we're going to have much of the same stuff anyway. But I think that it's very important for especially liberals and progressives who have seen Biden as the answer, that they put a lot of pressure on him to stop this tragedy. We could organize actions and happenings in many countries, especially those 5 I've just mentioned. And there's a way that you can donate to this effort, and it's a defense fund. In closing, I'd like to thank our guests and all the participants. We've had quite a few participants who've asked a lot of questions. Our coordinating committee, Randa Sharon, Satoko Noramatsu, and Peter Koznick, who are, along with David Vine and Harry Kaysen and others, are among those who initiated this coalition and formulated this comprehensive manifesto. I want also to thank John Rachel, who, along with Satoko, our webinar manager, has designed the flyer. Thanks also to Kathy Vogan, who helped with from Consortium News, and our other co-sponsors, Roots Action, World Beyond War, Covert Action Magazine, Project Censored, Media Freedom Foundation, National Lawyers Guild, and German Peace Council. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united shall never be defeated. Good night and good luck.
Santoso, could you also put up a new global contract, the email address on that? Could you put that up?
Right. All
A new
right.
global contract. We really need to come together similarly to what Gary was talking about. Oh, that's there we go.
Yeah.
So do get in touch with us. Do get in touch. It's organization that makes everything possible.
All right.
Great, great.
Yeah. Let's free Assange.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
It's morning here.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Marjorie. Bye, Daniel.